Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a Ukraine War Update Extra video, giving you extra nuggets and tidbits to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. Where should we go to first? Well, we're going to talk quite a bit about drones to begin with, but also about Scooby-Doo, because why not? Trent Telenko here says, yes, FPV drones doing their thing. First-person view drones. These are often racing drones that have the camera set to look forward in the direction that you are going rather than facing downwards. So you have some quadcopters will have or drones will have the cameras facing downwards, so you can look as a crow flies as to what you're seeing to drop things down. These are facing forward, so you're flying these as if you're in them, like an aeroplane or something, and you are hitting stuff at by looking forward through the drone's camera. Right. The question in my mind is, where are the Russian tactical trucks and military spec utility vehicles? These Scooby-Doo vans are impressed Russian civilian vehicles being used in a very tactical role if FPVs have the range to pick them off. So here, just a number of FPV drone hits on Scooby-Doo, 3 Russian Scooby-Doo vans here in this compiled bit of footage. But Trent Telenko is like, well, what does this tell us? We should be seeing Russian army vehicles like these. Okay, so these are the sorts of vehicles that the Russians should be using to do that kind of activity, right? But Russian army truck logistics have to be hurting very badly if they are having to substitute those sorts of vans for real tactical vehicles inside the footprint of first-person drone quadcopter, first-person view quadcopter drones. So that is a really good point. And actually, we can add to that, which is, Trent Selenko again today says, or was this today, yesterday, says it appears Ukrainian FPV drone attacks on Russian Scooby-Doo vans have resulted in Mad Max-style military adaptation. It won't stop an RPG-7 Warhead FPV, but it's something. And then we saw this the other day, and I almost reported this the other day. On Russian trains, we've seen these sorts of vehicles being shipped in. Russian victory is all but assured. The Scooby-Doo van is being deployed and blessed with holy water. Just incredible. But you were genuinely seeing really, I don't know, I would say inappropriate vehicles being shipped in to help the Russian military project here. And we've seen this for some time. Either when we do see trucks, they're old, very old 1950s, 60s, 70s trucks, or vehicles like this. It's just not what you'd expect for the second greatest army in the world, right? So yeah, it's concentrating on little things to see what they tell you, I think, is really important. Right. Remaining on drones, this is Samuel Bender, who's an autonomous robotic military systems expert. He and artificial intelligence. He says a quick thread on a Russian Telegram discussion of the advantages that Ukrainian volunteers have in assembling combat and FPV drones. Main points below from several pro-Kremlin Russian Telegram channels. So this is straight from pro-Russian sources. But they're discussing the advantages Ukrainians might have. In the Ukrainian military, volunteers are allowed to quietly test UAV prototypes at military ranges. We in Russia do everything at our own peril or risk. If we have such a military agreement to test, good. If not, let's go to the fields on our own and see how it all works. In the Ukrainian military, testing volunteer drone prototypes for electronic warfare countermeasures is done with the full support of the army. We in Russia do such testing ourselves, buy the jammers ourselves, check them ourselves. And the Ukrainian military volunteers quietly go to the front lines for UAV combat work, so drone combat work, and training of the military due to the established connections. No one interferes with them. No one kicks them out. No generals say that we cannot do that. We cannot do without it. What the hell is there to teach anyone? Volunteers who assemble drones in Ukraine receive state support, at least in terms of sharing experience. They hold meetings and conferences with the military. Our Russian enthusiasts rent garages to assemble drones at their own expense. 3D printers and electronics to assemble drones are bought at their own expense. Russian FPV drone assemblers are paid out-of-pocket salaries. or they work on sheer enthusiasm on weekends and in the evenings after work. I often hear from Russian officials that who theoretically have resources that could be directed to support FPV assembly initiatives. Quote, we don't have a mandate for this. This explains the implicit ban adopted in Russian state organizations and supports institutions when considering any projects that have a military special or dual purpose. In a country where martial law has been introduced in 4 regions and a heightened threat regime has been introduced in 8 more, this is rather strange. But the fact remains most Russian officials today have neither the right nor the obligation to help the front. This is quite a scathing analysis from this pro-Russian source here. Sam Bendit goes on to say this debate was triggered by the following RT video of 2 Ukrainian FPV drones recently downed by Russian forces. The main point, the FPVs are assembled from Chinese components, are cheap, and can be countered by electronic warfare. More on the role of Russian volunteers in drone assembly and delivery. So this is back to the Russians. Volunteers, despite their great merits, are not an option. It is necessary that these enthusiasts and craftsmen can be part of legal organizations so that they produce different UAVs in accordance with the requests and capabilities of the army, and that this is done systematically so that they can easily compete with large defense industry companies. And just as an aside, I'd absolutely agree. You can't have this bit this piecemeal approach to drone warfare. Drones, it's like saying, oh, we're piecing together tanks behind the line, just enthusiasts in their garages and getting up donations from the public to put together these tanks. You would never expect that, although that is happening with the Ukrainians, but that needs to be as like an extra addition to that which is being done from the kind of national institutional level. You need to build tanks, you need to get tanks from abroad or whatever. Drones are no different for tanks, as that these are a weapon of war now, and therefore the army needs to put them front and center of how they operate. And you are starting to see Ukraine do this with creating 3 specific specialized drone brigades. Well, the complaint here is the Russians just haven't formally embedded drones. I mean, there was talk at the beginning of the war that things like the Orlan 10 and Orlan 30, cheaper drones, they had those embedded in their units, and there was a better embedding of drone reconnaissance in the Russian units at that start. But I don't know whether the Orlan 10s and 30s have now been basically shot out the skies and lost to a large degree, and they're just not institutionally or organizationally, systematically supporting their armed forces, or creating these drones and supplying them to the front line in the way that they need to be, as according to these guys. So how would this work in practice? For example, a Russian military district holds a competition for the development of certain types of UAVs for its own needs, and then can independently purchase the UAV winners in accordance with its budget, while the commander would be personally responsible for the quality of these purchases and the resulting drone supplies to his subordinate forces. Such a system would contribute to increased competition and systematic work on that sounds like capitalism to me. The UAV production, well, it sounds like strategic planning with capitalism, that kind of mixed economy that I would advocate. The UAV production, their maintenance and repair, training of personnel and pilots, as well as a timely drone saturation of forces in accordance to their needs. Once again, volunteers are charity, and despite the volume of current Russian drone support, systemic military problems are not solved by charities. So the main question is how to create a system of drone production and delivery to the forces. This is back to Bendit, who says this is not the first nor the last time Russian Telegram channels are alluding to the fact that the military industrial enterprises have not delivered the required small quadcopters FPV drones to the front in needed quantities. With the volunteers still pulling the weight, there is widespread concern that Ukrainian drone manufacturing and integration efforts will result in a key advantage in the anticipated counter-offensive. I find that a really interesting thread, and I mean, it's good news if you're pro-Ukrainian that they have embraced, I think, to a large degree, although there are still criticisms. The article by Glenn Grant that I shared with you, talking about the shortfalls of the Ukrainian army. And one of them was to do with drones and to do with this whole kind of well, actually, partly using private enterprises to a much greater extent, but also, planning that into the brigade level to, to do this systematically. Now, I think the Ukrainians have actually taken that on board and have done that, and we are seeing a huge proliferation of drones throughout the Ukrainian forces. Right, moving on. Let's have a look at Budanov. Budanov, who is the head of Ukrainian military intelligence and has the demeanor of someone who is almost, I don't know whether it's almost patronizing or arrogant, but he has this great demeanor of making you think there's a lot more inside there than than he's willing to let out, of course, because he's head of intelligence. So I'll let you play a part of this interview, and then I'll actually go through what he says, reading out the subtitles, because I know a lot of you listen while you're at work and whatnot. But just this is him.
How damaging are these leaks?
We don't see any serious danger of this leak in topic of our nearest future offensive operation. So I can say, don't worry about this.
You spoke to your American counterparts about this,
We have spoken.
and you're investigating.
We investigated, United States, as I know, investigated, but we don't have a final decision.
So when he's speaking English, he's just not letting off an awful lot, Yeah, I'll say what I need to say. Ukraine's military spy chief spoke with the ABC News for his first US interview since the leak of the secret Pentagon documents. And we'll go on to have a look at what he says. He says any scandal of such a level is beneficial to only one side, and this is the Russian Federation. Russia is the only beneficiary of this. He then goes on. The question is then,
Stand it. Ukraine was a little reluctant to share some intelligence with America and others because it was worried that there could be leaks. Does this damage that relationship going forward, or does it risk damaging the relationship?
На мій погляд, жодного.
He says, in my mind, there is no risk whatsoever. There's a further question.
Said that Ukraine will attack Russia deeper and deeper into its own territory. These documents suggest that Ukraine is planning to attack Russian troops inside Russia. Is that
Я
correct?
не буду коментувати це.
So he says, I won't comment on it, and then goes on to say, which is fascinating. He said, we're at war, and the use of any means to eliminate the enemy who is killing our civilian population is justified. So that's a really massive claim to say, we're going to attack the Russians, then, so be it. That's well within our justification. We can do that. He says borders can little bit be changed. Again, that's a pretty controversial statement. He said this is an artificially created mistake, and now the moment has come for this country to collapse. We're talking about Russia. It's really, I could get onto the philosophy of borders and the fact that they're accidents of history and geography, and we think that they are some kind of objective fact, but they're not. They're just like arbitrary lines drawn on a map that people have consensus agreements over. And when you have a consensus agreement over, you kind of codify it into a map. No one to say that's right or wrong, and this is how we have wars. And people say, well, actually, we want that bit of land. And over time, nation states have well, we didn't even have nation states. We used to have city states, and then we kind of developed this idea of nation states, and then which is like, okay, we as a nation state, we don't just control this area around our city, like Athens. Like we're going to have this whole area of land which might have several cities in, and we're going to draw that line around there. And if you come into our land, effectively invade us, then we're going to attack you, and so on and so forth. So the idea of nation states developed, but those nation states have changed over time, and you had empires and different countries changing names as new rulers came about. Then you had monarchies and democracies and autocracies and dictatorships and whatnot, and everything's all just a big hot mess throughout history. We've got to a time where we have been educated through these through our schooling systems with maps on the wall, and that they are objective facts. And it's like, you can't do that. you can't invade there. And of course, you shouldn't invade there if it's a sovereign nation, but people do invade, and it's how we react to that. And this is a situation of that happening. So we've got a sovereign nation on a map, and we think, well, that's just an objective fact. It's not an objective fact, but those people who are living there believe that they are that country with that identity, and those are their borders. And the aggressor neighbor invading, like in centuries gone past, you wouldn't have heard about this the other side of the world. The world wasn't populated in that way. But now we feel like everything is so organized globally, and we're all in agreement about what the kind of common rules are. And you hear this term, well, the rule of law. It's like you can't. We've got this generally consensus agreed on rule of international law, and you have broken that, and you've invaded. Now, had that been the Mongol hordes, whatever amount of years ago, then someone living in the middle of England wouldn't have given two hoots. But now this impacts us because we live in this global community where everything is affected. Our lives are affected by things that happen in Ukraine and Russia, oil and gas and grain, and et cetera. And so, everyone has a part to play in keeping stability around the world, for our own benefits and for the benefit of the world as a whole. And when aggressors attack nations, that is breaking the rules, and we are all part of this larger community now. And if you break the rules, there needs to be some consequences. Now, there were no consequences in 2014, or the consequences were poorly adhered to or meted out. And now everyone's really serious about this. Okay, 2022's come along. You didn't think that we would react in a unified way, but we have. And now Budanov here is saying borders can be changed, though, still. So I don't know. That seems to be fairly controversial as far as Ukraine taking territory off Russia. But I guess I don't know whether he's really intimating that, Russia, there's a potential that it might collapse. And in fact, there's some really good videos I signposted to you the other day talking about what might happen with the collapse of Russia. Anyway, sorry, that's me going off on a sidebar there.
You famously predicted the invasion, the start of...
It's my job.
It's your job, I appreciate that, but not everyone did. I mean, there are other military leaders who thought it would be smaller, it would just be in Donbass, but you thought it would be how it turned out. Given that your prediction about the start of the latest invasion was correct, what is your prediction about when this ends?
In very, very nearest future.
Near future?
Very nearest.
Why are you so confident?
Because I know this.
And do you think it will end because of changes inside Russia, or it will end because of what happens on the battlefield?
This is a really hugely important thing he's saying here. I mean, this could all be bravado, it could be psyops, and he's saying, yeah, it's going to end pretty soon. I'm just supremely confident in the counteroffensive. And he says, is that confidence as a result of, the war itself, the front lines, or is it to do with Russia sort of collapsing, or that being a component? And he says, yeah, this is a really important component, internal issues within Russia.
And changing inside Russia, it's one of the main components.
Which, I mean, that's pretty huge, to be fair. So he goes on to say, the main task of this offensive operation is to liberate as much occupied territories as we can possibly do. The success of this offensive operation is badly needed. My personal point of view is that it is very important to see the success for those who are helping Ukraine now. This is such an important point, and he knows it. He knows that if Ukraine don't succeed in this counteroffensive, they will stop being supported by an awful lot of nations to the tune that they are being now. Ukraine need to get some success here to generate a positivity amongst allies so that they go, okay, we'll continue. We can see this is working. It's a bit like investing, right? In a company, in a startup company. If that company shows progress and promise, then you continue investing that, hoping to get a return on your investment. What you don't want to do is, the sunk cost fallacy, which is to keep investing even if it's going to go south. Now, when there's a moral dimension attached to that, things can get a little bit different. Yeah, we need to keep investing, because actually, if we don't, everything's going to go to shit. So there is that element. But from a purely kind of transactional point of view, he recognizes that Ukraine really need to show some success here to keep that stuff coming in. As he says, because without the victory, sooner or later questions will be asked whether it's worth continuing to support Ukraine. That's it. I mean, he's nailed it there. So back to the interviewer.
Whoever the beneficiary is, the contents alone, the fact that people are discussing this on a daily basis now, is damaging for Ukraine, is it not? Talking about special forces in the country, talking about the counter-offensive, talking about ammunition being low, talking about tactics against Russia. These are things you would rather were not being discussed in open.
Є проблема.
And he goes on to say, if there's a problem, it will be solved. If there's no problem, even better. I mean, obviously that tells you nothing really. This will not be able to affect the real results of the offensive operation. And that's kind of like the important point there, at least for Budanov, if that's true, that the leaks won't really affect the outcome of any counteroffensives. Anyway, I just thought it was interesting to give you a sense of who Budanov is and how he sees things and the great positivity he has in terms of assessing the outcome of the counteroffensives, but also that taking into account internal Russian political events. He has elsewhere said that Ukraine will be in Crimea by the end of spring. So, I'm not too sure about that. I'm not sure about the wisdom of such an approach. Anyway, let's move on to something different. Russians chilling out under a burning Russian BMP. This is quite an incredible bit of footage. Let's go back. So this BMP is on fire. And then it appears, I don't know if this is drone footage, you've got two Russians underneath as their vehicle appears to be on fire. Just, chilling out. Unless they're absolutely sure there's no ammunition in there, I'd say that is possibly not wise, but also sometimes I just can't help but feel sorry for. I know people say, but, yeah, sure, but you've got two desperate human beings under there. Just is that what your life has amounted to? It's just horrible. She's really horrible. A surprisingly self-aware Russian soldier reveals that he doesn't know why he's in Ukraine. So this is something that is really common and something I've talked about a lot in this intercepted call. He states that the locals were hostile to the invaders and being here makes little sense. Note that while published by the GUR recently, this call might be quite old. This is from Dmitry War Translated. I'm going to translate this for you myself because I think it's interesting to get an insight into what Russian soldiers are saying. So he's speaking possibly to his wife or something, who says, is there a village or town close to you? And he says, no, not far, but all these villages are Ukrainian. We're on Ukrainian territory. So why don't they sell you anything, right? They do sell. It's just that buying is fraught with consequences. You can get poisoned. The local population is not effing peacefully aligned towards us at all. Yeah, no shit, Sherlock. Right, I've heard about that, says his wife. I was speaking to the locals here. Quote, Vova Putin is, and then an insult, lost the effing plot. Doesn't he have enough land already? So these are the locals speaking to the Russian soldiers. The conversation ended with, and he quotes, F this, LPR, DPR is our civil war. Why the F did you even come here? What the F are you doing here? Which is, of course, a very good point. What are indeed they doing there? So I'm standing and thinking, why the F am I in Kharkiv? Why the F aren't we defending LPR, DPR? So that means the hohols, the slur for the Ukrainians, are right about this. Does Putin not have enough effing land? This is really interesting. So he's beginning to see the light, if you like. And she says, what is the commander saying? What for? What was the combat objective? Tactical defense. Although it's unclear why the F are we defending Kharkiv. No one called us here. Why the F are we here? So it's still going on about that. And that's where it ends. So just what you want is him to elucidate those concerns back to his wife, and then his wife to go and speak to people, and then people to understand back in Russia that, you know, the whole war is kind of pointless and no one knows why they're there, and it just seems that Putin wants more land, imperialistic desires. Okay, let's get on to Thomas Theiner's thread about mortars that I started the other day and realised I should do one on the M777 first, which I think was a really good thread. And now we've got the basis and understanding of how they work in terms of, you know, charges, primers, fuses, and the projectile itself. So now let's talk about mortars, who invented them, what types exist in NATO's arsenal, how they work, and how the modern battlefield would change their use. And this is Thomas Theiner, who's a former artilleryman himself. Before continuing, please read my earlier thread about the M777 and how that works. Done. Mortars and howitzers use both a combination of projectile, fuse, charge, and primer. And if you know how the basics of the M777 operation, you will easily understand this thread. The modern mortar was invented by Wilfred Stokes in January 1915 and used in World War I by the British Army, US Army, and the Portuguese Expeditionary Corps. To this day, the 81mm diameter Stokes chose for his barrel remains one of the 3 diameters in use by NATO armies. Besides Stokes' 81mm, NATO also uses 60mm and 120mm mortars. A mortar consists of a barrel, which is a soldier to, in fact, I'll show you on this picture, a barrel, which is a soldier to the left, has in his hand a base plate and sight, a soldier in the center, and a bipod, soldier to the right. So that bipod acts with the mortar barrel itself as effectively a tripod, and then you have a base and the sighting as well. So all of NATO's mortars, except for the French RTF1, use smoothbore barrel, left image, while the RTF1 uses a rifled barrel, which is the right image. Now, if you remember, the rifled barrel has rifling down the barrel that spins the projectile as it comes out to give it greater stability and accuracy in the air. However, most mortars, the projectile have like fins or, you know, sort of fins attached to the tail to give it spin stabilization. As it goes on to say here, smoothbore projectiles are fin stabilized, rifle projectiles are spin stabilized. Spin stabilization is more accurate and has a greater range, but as most mortars have a range of just a few kilometers, fin stabilization is sufficient. If these terms are unfamiliar to you, of course, I have an earlier thread that explains these terms and how smoothbore and rifle barrels work. So I guess that French one would give you a little bit more range for having a spinning projectile rather than the fin stabilized one, which would have more drag in the air, I would have thought. So 60mm and 81mm mortars can be carried by troops, i.e. this US Army 4th Infantry Division Mortar Squad carries a M252 81mm mortar up a hill in Colorado. 120mm mortars are either towed or transported on trailers. 120mm are also commonly mounted on mortar carriers, so you get self-propelled mortars. As the range of 60mm mortars is limited and their recoil is small, they can also be fired without a bipod and sight unit if the mortar team has a clear and direct line of sight at the impacts. So there you have it, without the bipod there, and the soldiers themselves are holding it, and you can see the kind of fin stabilization in the back of that mortar projectile. A high explosive HE smoothbore mortar round consists of a fin assembly in the rear, the projectile in the center, a fuse in the front. As rifled rounds don't need fins, they replace the fin assembly with a tail charge assembly. I'll explain this further down. Besides high explosive rounds, there are also smoke, illumination, and practice rounds, and naturally GPS guided rounds like the Israeli GMM 120 also includes a semi-active laser guidance seeker, or the Swedish Strix, which uses an infrared sensor to guide itself. So you can see different sorts of mortar rounds. Some of these are quite substantial in size. So that guides itself autonomously onto enemy vehicles, or the US GPS guided M395PGMM. So that's the one that is pictured just here. But to make, I mean, that's a big old mortar round, isn't it? But to make things easier, I will focus on high explosive projectiles. As the name says, these are filled with a high explosive. Upon detonation, they burst into a hail of shrapnel that is fatal in a 35-meter radius. The detonation is triggered by the fuse, of which there are three main types. I'm using this pic from Young'uns Defense as it shows all three types. Impact or point detonating, 3 to the left. What these do is they will explode as the projectile hits. Kind of like think of it as pressing a button. Multi-option in the center, and time, 3 to the right. So they can be set to explode in a given time, and that can be before it hits, so the shrapnel sprays out over a wider area, so on and so forth. Impact and multi-option are used for high explosive projectiles, while time fuses are used for illumination and smoke. I guess that you can send them to illuminate in the air so they explode before they hit the ground or after they've hit the ground, and then smoke comes out. By turning the top of the multi-option fuse, you can choose among 4 detonation modes: proximity, near surface, impact, or delay. Doppler radar trigger, proximity equals airburst against infantry lying on the ground or in trenches. So that was what I was telling you about. So proximity, it will explode before it hits the ground, and it will spray out shrapnel that will, a bit like the airburst version of the artillery ammunition, it will then spray out shrapnel over a wider area, in this case talking about infantry lying on the ground. Whereas if it hit the ground, it would have a much smaller sort of radius of damage it would do, and much of the explosive energy would be taken out, I guess, on the ground itself, rather than exploding out to all those sort of people lying down. Near surface, so this is a near surface airburst against infantry on the move. So I guess the proximity might be airburst that's further back. I don't know. Correct me if I'm wrong. They're near surface even closer, or vice versa. Crush switch trigger, impact self-explanatory, so explodes on impact. Delay 0.05 seconds after impact against structures, i.e. dugouts, to avoid premature detonation in a forest canopy. Interesting. To understand how mortar rounds are propelled out of the barrel and onto a target, let's look at a smoothbore fin assembly, which consists of a flash tube with holes, an ignition charge inside the flash tube, and the fins. The ignition charge consists of firing pin and percussion primer, as well as a small black powder ignition charge in the aluminum assembly at the bottom, and a propellant charge encased in paper and polyethylene terephthalate. The ignition cartridge is inserted into the flash tube and is powerful enough to propel the mortar round out of the barrel, but not much further. To increase the range, propellant increments are clipped into the flash tube. These are colloquially known as C charges due to their shape. So basically you have a bit of propellant, a bit of ignition shoving it out of the tube, and then this propellant takes over. NATO mortar rounds come ready to fire with attached fuse, inserted ignition cartridge, and a maximum number of propellant increments. So if the fire mission isn't at maximum range, C charges have to be removed. Unused C charges are usually burned. Before you can fire a round, you need to set up and sight your mortar. Sighting an indirect fire weapon is all maths and trigonometry. I hate it, but I will do a thread about it one day, maybe. Ugh. So you need to work out where you're firing at, and etc., etc. And I'm sure the use of drones will help out immensely. Once you have sighted your mortar, set deflection and elevation for the fire mission at hand. Have set the correct number of C charges and a correct fuse option, you're ready to fire by letting gravity do your job. All you need to do is drop the round down the barrel. Gravity accelerates the round down the barrel until the ignition cartridge makes contact with the barrel's firing pin, which triggers the firing pin inside the ignition cartridge, which in turn sets off the percussion primer, which sets off the black powder charge, which sets off the propellant charge, which blasts out of the flash tube's holes and sets off the C charges, and all the explosive power then propels around towards the barrel and towards the enemy. Most mortars' firing pin is a simple metal pin that is screwed into the barrel's bottom. A few 120mm mortars have a retractable firing pin with a coil screw that allows the use of a lanyard to fire a round, but the add-on is only really needed on the rifled RTF1 mortar. The ammo for the rifled RTF1 mortar works exactly the same, but without the fins. And as spin-stabilized projectiles allow for a longer range, RTF1 uses a lot more color-coded propellant increments, which results in a much bigger muzzle flash, hence the use of a lanyard. So you don't want to be right next to the mortar. Bit too much of a flash. These things go a longer way, and they have more propellants to thrust them out of the tube and further on. Furthermore, at the top of the tail charge assembly is an ejecting charge that, upon detonation, separates projectile and tail charge assembly, which is then ejected a few moments after the projectile from the barrel. This is why it's very unwise to stand in front of an RTF1. Yeah. I will close out this thread with a video of a US Marine Corps crew showing why mortars are so important on the battlefield, namely their rate of fire. So just have a look at this video. It's just absolutely insane rate of fire. Because these are heavy, you see those two people taking over. One, the arms get a bit tired, so he takes over and gives the projectiles to the other, and that person loads them in. And although I don't know whether there's no adjustment of the sighting here, there's going to be variation to these. So as they fire into the air, you're going to have wind, you're going to have air resistance, you're going to have slight differentiations in like maybe the manufacture of each of these things and the propellant explosions and so on and so forth, so that even though they're firing off like 10 rounds and they're not changing the barrel, I assume, and I'm just speculating, I have no idea, this is literally just come out of my head, I assume that they'll all land in vaguely different places, so you're kind of, it's a barrage rather than all land on exactly the same point each time. And there you go. So, tomorrow he says I will continue with a thread about mortar carries, which will be full of videos. P.S. Luckily, some other person reminded me of an important advantage of rifled mortar rounds. They contain much more high explosive than smoothbore rounds. High explosive projectile weight of a smoothbore is 14.2 kilograms, but of the rifled, it's 18.7 kilograms. And people have asked for the range of the 120 mortars. Range of the smoothbore is 7.2 kilometers. The rifled standard projectiles are 8.2 kilometers, and the rifle rocket assisted projectiles are 13 kilometers. And that is the reason France, Italy, Belgium, and Netherlands love the RTF1 mortars. So there you go. So some of that, this is worth dipping into. So someone says, I've seen a lot of fire correction in Ukraine through drone surveillance. How is it normally done without drones and no direct line of sight? And Thomas Theiner says, forward observers, drones and or infantry platoons call in fire support. And you get lots of different form. I mean, in the old days, you used to get people with and still now people with binoculars and whatnot. You'll get reconnaissance teams and there'll be different elements of intelligence coming in that give you an idea of where you are. firing. And in the last bit for today, I have another hedgehog movie for you. This is a hedgehog who's well and truly caught up, and we have a Ukrainian soldier coming to its rescue, and it's quite delightful because everyone wants to see the survival of hedgehogs. This is super cool. And that little hedgehog is wrapped up in its defensive ball. I'm now giving you hedgehog survival commentary, which is a very particular form of YouTube niche. Anyway, as the music suggests, all will end well, and this hedgehog is freed to forage another day. And its little nose is poking out there. And that's his way of saying, you know, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'll do it through nose movements or something. Anyway, really appreciate all the support you give to the channel. Please like, subscribe, and share. Thank you so much to all the wonderful supporters such as Niels, Amar, JG Bashlow, Mark Schwarman, and Christoph on Buy Me a Coffee. Really appreciate your support there. Thank you so much. Anyway, toodle pips, and I will speak to you tomorrow.